The gate agent's voice cracked through the intercom, calling final boarding for flight 212, and Margaret Whitfield stood frozen at gate C14 with her daughter's hand clenched in hers while her husband walked past her without looking back. "Daniel," she said, and her voice broke in the middle of his name. "You're just going to leave us here?" He didn't stop walking. He adjusted his jacket, glanced at his watch, and said over his shoulder, "You'll figure it out, Margaret, you always do." Behind him, a woman in a red coat looped her arm through his elbow like she'd done it 100 times before, and she laughed at something only the two of them understood. Margaret's daughter, 6 years old and clutching a stuffed rabbit, looked up and asked the question that would haunt the next 10 minutes of her mother's life. "Mommy, where's Daddy going?" Margaret didn't answer. She couldn't. She just watched the man she had married 11 years earlier disappear down the jet bridge with another woman, boarding a flight to Aspen that her own airline had scheduled, on a plane her own company had built, using a boarding pass that existed only because her family had spent 40 years turning a bankrupt regional carrier into the 4th largest airline in North America. If you've ever been discarded by someone who never once bothered to ask what you were actually worth, stay with this story until the very end, because what happens to Daniel Whitfield in the next 10 minutes is the kind of reckoning most people only dream about. And if stories like this hit something real in you, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe, because this channel exists for exactly this feeling. 3 hours earlier, the morning had started like any other. Margaret had been in the kitchen of their Connecticut home, packing her daughter Charlotte's lunch, when Daniel came downstairs already dressed for a trip he hadn't mentioned. "Where are you headed?" she asked, not suspicious, just making conversation the way a wife does after 11 years of marriage. "Work thing," he said, not looking at her, scrolling his phone. "Colorado, back Sunday." She nodded and kept cutting the crusts off Charlotte's sandwich, because that was the rhythm of their life now, brief, clipped exchanges that passed for communication. She hadn't always accepted that rhythm. There had been a time, years earlier, when Daniel used to sit at that same counter and tell her everything, his frustrations at the mid-level logistics firm where he worked, his dreams of running his own company someday, his fear that he'd never measure up to the family she came from. Back then she told him the truth would have complicated things, so she'd let him believe what he wanted to believe. She'd let him think she was simply Margaret, a quiet woman with a business degree and a modest trust fund, the daughter of people who'd once run a small charter service out of a regional airport in Ohio. She never told him that the modest charter service was Whitfield Aviation Group, now valued north of $10 billion, with hubs in 14 countries and a board of directors who answered to her, and only her, since her father's death 4 years earlier. She had made that choice deliberately, the same way her father had taught her to make every important choice, quietly and with her eyes open. Her father, Walter Whitfield, had built the company from a single leased Cessna in 1976, back when everyone in the industry told him a man with no family money and no connections had no business trying to run an airline. He used to say the same thing to Margaret every night at dinner when she was young. "The sky doesn't ask where you came from, Maggie. It only asks if you show up." She had grown up around hangars instead of playgrounds, learned to read a balance sheet before she learned to drive, and watched her father turn skepticism into respect, one contract, one route, one impossible deal at a time. When she met Daniel at a friend's wedding 12 years ago, she saw an ambitious, hungry young man who reminded her, in some small way, of her father before the money came. She wanted for once in her life to be loved for herself and not for the empire behind her name, so she hid it. She wore plain clothes to their early dates. She told him she worked in aviation logistics, which was technically true and revealed nothing. She let him fall in love with an ordinary version of her, and for a few years it was enough. But something had shifted after Charlotte was born, and Margaret had felt it happening in real time, the way you feel a storm system building on the horizon long before the first drop of rain falls. Daniel had gotten a promotion at his firm, started traveling more, started coming home with a new kind of restlessness in his eyes. He'd stopped asking about her day. He'd started comparing her, subtly at first, to the wives of his colleagues, women who wore designer labels and posted vacation photos and seemed, in his words, like they were actually living. Margaret had absorbed those comments the way she absorbed everything, quietly, without visible reaction, filing them away in some private room in her chest that she never opened in front of him. She told herself it was a phase. She told herself marriages had rough seasons. She told herself a lot of things, actually, because the alternative, admitting that the man she loved had started to resent the very steadiness that once drew him to her, was too painful to sit with for very long. Then 4 months ago she found the hotel receipt in his jacket pocket while doing laundry, 2 names on the reservation. Hers wasn't one of them. She hadn't confronted him immediately. Instead, she did what her father had trained her to do her entire life. She watched, she gathered, she waited. She noticed the new cologne. She noticed the phone that had suddenly acquired a passcode after 11 years of an open lock screen. She noticed the work trips that never quite matched his calendar when she checked, quietly, through channels he didn't know she had access to. And she noticed the woman, Vanessa Reyes, a marketing director at a rival firm, showing up in the background of 3 separate business dinners Daniel claimed he attended alone. "Is everything okay with you and Daniel?" her sister-in-law Patricia asked her over coffee one afternoon, and Margaret had almost laughed at the question, not because it was funny, but because she genuinely didn't know how to answer it anymore. "He's just stressed," Margaret said instead. "Work's been a lot." Patricia studied her for a long moment. "You know you don't have to protect him, right? Even to me." Margaret smiled, the small, controlled smile she'd perfected over years of board meetings where men twice her age underestimated her before she opened her mouth. "I'm not protecting him," she said. "I'm just not ready yet." Patricia didn't ask what she meant by that, and Margaret didn't explain, because some things you don't say out loud until you're standing close enough to the fire to feel its heat. The trip to Aspen had been the final piece. Daniel told her it was a work retreat, but Margaret had learned through her own company's internal booking system that the flight, the hotel, and the return ticket had all been charged not to his firm, but to a personal account linked to Vanessa Reyes. And she'd learned something else, something that made her sit very still at her kitchen table for almost 20 minutes after she found it. Daniel had booked 2 seats, one for himself, one for Vanessa. And when Margaret had, almost on impulse, decided she and Charlotte would accompany him to the airport that morning under the pretense of a family outing, some small, hopeful part of her had wondered if she was wrong, if there was an explanation, if 11 years of marriage deserved one more chance before she let the truth detonate everything. There wasn't an explanation. There was only Daniel, standing at gate C14, visibly irritated that his wife and daughter had shown up unannounced, and a woman in a red coat waiting a few feet away with a boarding pass already in hand. "What are you even doing here, Margaret?" Daniel had hissed, pulling her aside while Charlotte clutched her rabbit and stared at the strange woman by the window. "This isn't a good time." "I thought we could see you off," Margaret said evenly. "As a family," Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're embarrassing me." "I'm embarrassing you," Margaret repeated, and something in her chest went very cold and very still, the way still water goes right before it freezes. "Daniel, who is that woman?" He didn't answer right away, and that silence told her everything the receipts and the passcodes and the mismatched bookings had already told her. Vanessa, apparently tired of waiting in the background, walked over then, unbothered, almost amused. "You must be Margaret," she said, extending a hand Margaret didn't take. "Daniel's told me so much about you." "I doubt that," Margaret said quietly. "He hasn't told me much about you either, so I suppose we're even." Vanessa laughed, a short, sharp sound. "He said you were quiet. I didn't realize quiet meant boring." Daniel didn't correct her. That was the detail Margaret would return to later, again and again, in the weeks that followed. He didn't correct her. He let the insult stand there in the open air between them unchallenged, the way you let something die that you've already decided you don't need anymore. "Daniel," Margaret said, and she kept her voice level even as Charlotte's small hand tightened around hers. "Your daughter is standing right here." "Then maybe you shouldn't have brought her," he snapped, and the words landed harder than anything else he'd said, because it wasn't cruelty aimed at her anymore. It was cruelty aimed at a 6-year-old who had woken up early that morning excited to say goodbye to her father. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a door closing somewhere deep and quiet that would never open again. "You have a flight to catch," she said finally. Daniel blinked, thrown slightly off balance by how calm she sounded. "That's it, you're not going to make a scene." "I don't make scenes, Daniel," Margaret said. "I never have. That's always been the problem, hasn't it? You mistook my quiet for weakness." He didn't have a response to that, or if he did, he didn't have time to give it, because the gate agent called final boarding, and Vanessa was already tugging at his sleeve, eager to get away from the wife who was making the whole thing feel far less romantic than she'd imagined it would. "You'll figure it out, Margaret," Daniel said, the words he'd toss over his shoulder like a scrap to a dog. "You always do." And then he walked away down the jet bridge with another woman on his arm, leaving his wife and daughter standing at the gate in front of dozens of strangers who had all, in one way or another, stopped what they were doing to watch. If this story is hitting you somewhere real right now, go ahead and hit that like button, because what's coming next is worth staying for. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because this channel is full of stories exactly like this one, ordinary people who were underestimated right up until the moment everything changed. Margaret didn't cry at the gate. She wouldn't allow herself that, not in front of Charlotte, not in front of strangers, not in front of the gate agent who had clearly seen and heard everything, and was now watching Margaret with an expression that flickered, just briefly, between pity and something else entirely, something closer to recognition. That agent, a young woman named Priya, had actually met Margaret once before, 18 months earlier, at a corporate town hall Margaret had quietly attended in the back row without announcing who she was. Priya's eyes narrowed slightly, like she was trying to place a face out of context, and then very deliberately she said nothing because she wasn't certain, and because it wasn't her place to say anything even if she was. Margaret picked Charlotte up, settled her on her hip even though the girl was getting too big for it, and carried her out of the terminal without a single backward glance at the jet bridge that had swallowed her husband whole. In the car, Charlotte asked again, quieter this time, "Is Daddy mad at us?" Margaret kept her eyes on the road and her voice steady. "No, sweetheart, Daddy's just confused about what matters." She didn't cry until that night after Charlotte was asleep, when she finally sat alone in the dark of her study, and allowed herself 10 full minutes of grief for the marriage she had actually believed in, the version of Daniel she had fallen in love with before ambition curdled into resentment and resentment curdled into cruelty. Then she wiped her face, opened her laptop, and did what she had been trained to do since she was old enough to sit in on her father's meetings. She got to work. The first call she made was to her chief of staff, a sharp, unflappable woman named Renata Cole, who had worked for Walter Whitfield for 2 decades before working for his daughter. "I need everything on Daniel's employer," Margaret said. "Contracts, vendor relationships, anything that touches us." Renata didn't ask why, because she already knew enough about Daniel to guess, and because in 11 years she had learned that Margaret Whitfield never made a request without a reason. Within 2 hours, Renata had the answer Margaret suspected, but hadn't confirmed. Daniel's firm, Halbrook Logistics, handled ground freight coordination for exactly one airline client, Whitfield Aviation Group. 12% of Halbrook's annual revenue came from a services contract with Margaret's own company. A contract that had been quietly renewed every year without much scrutiny, because it had always performed adequately, and nobody had ever had a reason to look closer. Margaret looked closer. What she found over the following 2 weeks reshaped the entire situation, layer by layer, in a way that even she hadn't fully anticipated. Vanessa Reyes wasn't simply Daniel's mistress. She was Halbrook's marketing director, yes, but she was also, according to internal emails Renata's team quietly surfaced through legitimate audit channels, the architect of a plan to pitch Halbrook as the exclusive logistics partner for Whitfield's entire western region, a contract worth close to $40 million annually, a contract that would require unseating Whitfield's current, more expensive but more reliable partner. And Daniel, it turned out, was not simply cheating on his wife with a colleague. He was actively lobbying, in meetings Margaret had no official reason to attend, for his own company to win a massive contract with the airline he had no idea belonged to her. He had been building his own leverage on the back of a marriage he no longer respected, using a relationship with Vanessa that was as much about ambition as it was about attraction, unaware the entire time that the woman whose signature would ultimately need to approve or reject the contract was the same woman he'd left standing at a departure gate with their daughter. Margaret sat with that information for 3 full days before she decided what to do with it. Her first instinct, the human instinct, was rage, the kind of clean, uncomplicated fury that wants to burn everything down immediately. But her father's voice moved through her mind the way it always did in moments like this. "Anger is a fire that keeps you warm for a night and burns your house down by morning, Maggie. Strategy is the fire that lasts." So she didn't act immediately. She let Daniel come home from Aspen 4 days later, sunburned and vague about the details of his retreat, and she said almost nothing about it, which unsettled him more than an argument would have. "You're being weird," he told her on his second night back. "I thought you'd at least yell at me." "Would that make you feel better?" Margaret asked. "At least it would feel honest," he said. Margaret almost laughed at that, the audacity of a man asking his wife for honesty 3 days after he'd walked past her at an airport gate with his mistress on his arm. "I am being honest, Daniel," she said instead. I'm just not interested in giving you the reaction you want." 2 weeks later, Halbrook Logistics submitted its formal pitch to win the Western Region contract, and the presentation was scheduled to take place in front of Whitfield Aviation's executive board, a board Margaret chaired but rarely appeared before in person, preferring instead to let her chief operating officer run day-to-day meetings while she worked from behind the scenes, the same way her father had taught her, letting people underestimate the quiet woman in the corner until the moment it mattered. This time Margaret decided it mattered. Daniel and Vanessa arrived at Whitfield's downtown headquarters that Thursday morning with a slide deck, a rehearsed pitch, and no idea whatsoever whose company they were standing in. Daniel had been inside a Whitfield building exactly twice before, both times for minor vendor meetings that never rose above middle management, and he had certainly never been told, because there had never been a reason to tell him, who actually sat at the head of the boardroom table. Margaret watched from a small adjoining office through a video feed as Daniel straightened his tie in the hallway mirror, practicing his opening line under his breath, while Vanessa checked her makeup and murmured something that made him laugh, easy and confident, a man who believed he was about to seal the biggest win of his career. "You ready?" Renata asked quietly, standing beside Margaret in the observation room. "I've been ready for 11 years, Margaret said, and walked toward the boardroom doors. The room went quiet the moment she entered, not because anyone recognized her immediately, but because the executive assistants flanking the door straightened visibly, and the current COO, a man named Franklin Voss, rose from his seat and said, "Mrs. Whitfield, we weren't expecting you today," in a tone that made every head at the table turn. Daniel's smile, mid-sentence, froze on his face. His eyes moved from the COO to the woman walking toward the head of the table, and Margaret watched the exact moment recognition detonated behind his eyes, watched the color drain out of his face in real time as 11 years of assumptions collapsed all at once. "Margaret," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. "What are you doing here?" "I chair this board, Daniel," Margaret said, taking her seat at the head of the table with the same calm, unhurried composure she brought to every difficult conversation in her life. "I believe you're here to pitch a contract to my company." The silence that followed was the loudest silence Margaret had ever experienced, and she let it stretch, deliberate and unbroken, the way her father had taught her to let silence do its work before she said another word. Vanessa's confident posture had gone rigid. Daniel's mouth opened and closed twice without producing a sound. "Your company," he finally repeated, as though saying the words might somehow make them untrue. "My father built this airline from a single leased aircraft in 1976, Margaret said, her voice carrying evenly across the room. "I've run it since he passed. Whitfield Aviation Group. 10.2 billion in annual revenue, 14 countries, and a Western Region logistics contract that you flew here today hoping to win." She let that land fully before continuing. "You once told me at an airport gate in front of our daughter that I'd figure it out. I did figure it out, Daniel. I figured out everything." Franklin Voss, sensing the moment had shifted into territory well beyond a standard vendor pitch, quietly suggested the room take a short recess, and most of the executives filed out, murmuring, leaving Daniel, Vanessa, Margaret, and Renata alone at the long table. "This doesn't have to affect the contract," Vanessa said quickly, her professional instincts kicking in even through visible panic. "This is business. What happens between you two personally shouldn't." "It absolutely should," Margaret cut in, calm and final. "You spent months building leverage against a company you didn't realize I controlled, using a relationship you built with my husband while I was raising our daughter alone. That's not separate from business, Vanessa. That is the business." Daniel finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than Margaret had ever heard it. "Maggie, I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know any of this." "I know you didn't know," Margaret said, and for the first time that morning something almost like sadness moved across her face. "That's exactly the problem, Daniel. You spent 11 years married to me and you never once asked enough questions to find out who I actually was. You decided I was ordinary, and once you decided that, you stopped looking. You stopped seeing me entirely. And a man who stops seeing his own wife will eventually stop seeing everything else too, including the ground he's standing on." Within the hour, Halbrook's pitch was formally declined, not out of vindictiveness, Margaret made clear to the full board when they reconvened, but because a genuine, disqualifying conflict of interest had come to light, one that any responsible chair would have flagged regardless of personal history. The board didn't need convincing. Within a month, word moved through Halbrook's leadership about why the Whitfield deal had collapsed, and Daniel found himself quietly, professionally frozen out, no longer trusted with major accounts, his name now attached to a costly failure the firm couldn't easily forgive. Vanessa lasted 2 more months at Halbrook before resigning, taking a position at a smaller firm 3 states away, and Daniel never heard from her again after the day the severance paperwork was signed. The warmth she'd offered him, it turned out, had never really been about him at all. It had been about proximity to something bigger, and once that something bigger was gone, so was she. Margaret filed for divorce quietly, without a single public statement, without drama, exactly the way she handled everything that mattered most. She secured full custody of Charlotte without a fight because Daniel, stripped of his job and his mistress and his illusions all in the same season, didn't have much fight left in him. He moved into a small apartment 2 towns over and saw Charlotte every other weekend, arriving each time a little more humbled, a little more careful with his words, a man slowly learning, far too late, the value of the woman and the daughter he had once dismissed at a departure gate as an inconvenience. Margaret never gossiped about him. She never posted about it, never let his name become a punchline at dinner parties, never used her position to make his humiliation any louder than it already was on its own. Her father had taught her that too. You don't have to push people off a ledge they're already walking toward on their own. She simply moved forward, steady and unhurried, running the airline her father built, raising the daughter she loved fiercely. And one evening, months later, standing on the tarmac of the small regional airport where her father had first started with a single leased plane, she watched Charlotte run across the grass with her arms spread wide like wings, chasing the shadow of an aircraft climbing into the golden evening sky, and Margaret felt, for the first time in a very long while, completely and quietly whole. Some people will only ever measure your worth by what they can see on the surface, by the coat you wear, the car you drive, the volume of the room you're standing in. But real value has never needed an audience to be real. Build in silence, hold your worth close, and when the moment finally comes to let the truth speak for itself, you won't need to raise your voice at all. If Margaret's story meant something to you, tell me in the comments what you'd want the people who underestimated you to finally understand. Like this video if you believe quiet strength always wins in the end, and subscribe for more stories of betrayal, resilience, and the kind of reckonings some people never see coming.